Nevada holds more restricted federal land than almost any other state in the country, and a striking amount of what the government has built there over the past 70 years was built downward rather than upward. Beneath the desert north of Las Vegas sit excavated tunnels, sealed test chambers, and underground laboratories built for nuclear weapons research, none of them open to the public, several of them still active today. This video counts down 9 real underground places in Nevada, from a tunnel complex more than 900 feet beneath the desert where the United States still conducts classified plutonium experiments, to a 5-mile exploratory tunnel bored through a mountain that has never received a single shipment of the nuclear waste it was built to hold. Every site on this list is documented by the Department of Energy, the National Nuclear Security Administration, or Federal Environmental and Historical Records. None of them allow public entry. Stay with me to the end, because the final site on this list contains tunnels still radioactive enough today that the federal government will not say when, if ever, the public will be allowed anywhere near them. Let's begin. In the high desert roughly 90 miles northwest of Las Vegas, the Nevada National Security Site, known for most of the 20th century as the Nevada Test Site, spans an area larger than the state of Rhode Island, more than 1,350 square miles of restricted federal land, bordered on 3 sides by an additional several thousand square miles of equally restricted Air Force range. Between 1951 and 1992, the site hosted 928 announced nuclear tests, 100 of them detonated in the open air, and 828 of them set off underground, making it the primary nuclear testing ground for the United States for more than 4 decades. The underground tests left the landscape permanently altered. Each explosion vaporized an enormous underground chamber, some of them buried as deep as 5,000 feet, leaving behind a collapsed crater on the surface, a phenomenon that pockmarks the site's Yucca Flat basin with hundreds of visible subsidence craters today. By the time underground testing ended in 1992, the Department of Energy estimated that more than 300 million curies of radioactivity remained in the surrounding environment, making the site, by some measures, one of the most radioactively contaminated locations anywhere in the United States. The entire site remains under the management of the National Nuclear Security Administration today, closed to the public, with access granted only to authorized personnel conducting ongoing nuclear stockpile research and environmental monitoring work that, more than 3 decades after the last full-scale nuclear test, still has not finished accounting for everything the testing program left behind. Beneath Rainier and Aqueduct mesas, in Area 12 of the Nevada National Security Site, a series of tunnel complexes given individual letter designations B, C, D, E, F, G, I, J, K, N, P, and T were mined directly into the rock specifically to conduct underground nuclear weapons effects testing, a category of experiment distinct from the larger shaft-based detonations conducted elsewhere on the site. 61 nuclear tests were carried out beneath the mesas between 1957 and 1992, the tunnels providing a controlled environment to study exactly how nuclear detonations affected military equipment, structures, and materials placed at calculated distances from the blast. The U-12N tunnel alone hosted 22 separate nuclear tests between 1967 and 1992, while the nearby U-12T tunnel hosted 6 more nuclear weapons effects tests and an additional high-explosive test through 1987, each detonation sealed off afterward within its own dedicated section of tunnel. Government-commissioned historical surveys of these tunnel systems, conducted decades later at the request of the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense, describe the underground tunnel complexes today simply as sealed and unavailable, with only surface buildings, structures, and equipment remaining accessible for historical documentation. The mesas themselves remain part of the active, restricted security site, their tunnel networks closed permanently behind rock and concrete, a honeycomb of nuclear test chambers that, unlike Yucca Flat's open craters, leave almost no visible trace on the surface at all. 960 feet beneath the surface of the Nevada desert, in Area 1 of the Nevada National Security Site, a mined underground laboratory known as the U-1. A complex remains one of the only places in the United States where scientists still work directly with plutonium in experiments designed to simulate the extreme conditions inside a detonating nuclear weapon. Originally excavated in the 1960s for a nuclear test that was ultimately canceled, the shaft was reopened in 1988, and in 1990 it hosted the underground Ladue test, one of the last full-scale nuclear detonations conducted by the United States, before the 1992 testing moratorium ended the program for good. Since that moratorium, the complex has been repurposed for what are known as subcritical experiments, in which a small sample of plutonium, never more than a few ounces, is subjected to a contained chemical explosion intense enough to mimic the pressures of a nuclear detonation without ever triggering an actual nuclear chain reaction. Access to the underground laboratory is provided by two separate mechanical hoist shafts descending nearly a fifth of a mile into solid rock, leading to roughly a mile and a half of mine tunnels and experimental alcoves, several of which have been permanently sealed after housing a completed test. The facility remains fully active today, with a billion-dollar expansion currently under construction to house a new generation of diagnostic equipment for studying plutonium's behavior, meaning that nearly 1,000 feet beneath the Nevada desert, the United States government continues conducting classified nuclear weapons research in tunnels the public will never be permitted to see. 11 miles north of the Nevada National Security Site's primary plutonium testing laboratory, a separate underground facility known as P-Tunnel, takes a markedly different physical form, bored directly into the side of a mesa rather than accessed by a vertical shaft, allowing scientists and equipment to walk in from a parking lot and travel deeper into the mountain by rail. Unlike many of the site's older tunnel complexes, sealed permanently after a single Cold War-era test, P-Tunnel remains an active research facility conducting work specifically focused on nuclear non-proliferation. The tests conducted inside P-Tunnel today involve detonating large quantities of conventional explosives, not for weapons development, but to record the seismic and infrasound signals the explosions produce. Data that helps researchers refine the United States' ability to detect other nations attempting to conduct secret, low-yield nuclear tests in violation of international treaties. In effect, a tunnel originally built within a Cold War weapons testing complex has been repurposed to help catch other countries trying to do what the United States itself once did openly at the very same site. P-Tunnel remains restricted exclusively to authorized federal researchers and Department of Energy personnel, its ongoing non-proliferation testing work continuing largely unnoticed by a public that, decades after the Cold War ended, generally assumes American nuclear testing in Nevada stopped entirely in 1992. Roughly 44 miles southwest of the Nevada National Security Site, Yucca Mountain has spent more than 3 decades at the center of one of the longest-running infrastructure debates in American history, a site selected by Congress in 1987 to become the nation's sole permanent underground repository for high-level nuclear waste generated by commercial power plants across the entire country. Over the following decades, the Department of Energy spent billions of dollars excavating tunnels and conducting extensive geological research deep inside the mountain to determine whether its rock could safely contain nuclear waste for the tens of thousands of years required for it to become harmless. A 5-mile exploratory tunnel was bored directly through the mountain specifically to study its rock composition and long-term geological stability, accompanied by underground testing facilities used to model exactly how sealed waste containers might behave over time, scales longer than any human civilization has yet existed. Despite this massive scientific and financial investment, the mountain has never received a single shipment of nuclear waste, caught for decades in an unresolved political standoff between federal energy policy and the state of Nevada, which has consistently and successfully opposed hosting the nation's nuclear waste within its borders. Funding for the project was effectively halted in 2011, leaving Yucca Mountain in a strange limbo. A fully excavated, scientifically extensive underground facility that has never served the purpose it was built for, and given the political deadlock surrounding it, may never serve that purpose at all. Its tunnels sealed off from the public for a project that has technically never actually started. In the southern portion of the Nevada National Security Site, an area known as Frenchman Flat hosted the very first nuclear test ever conducted at the facility. A 1-kiloton bomb dropped from a bomber on January 27, 1951, and went on to host additional atmospheric tests in the years that followed before underground testing became the standard method after 1962. Today, Frenchman Flat serves an entirely different but equally restricted purpose, functioning as an outdoor laboratory for research into nuclear forensics, emergency response training, and hazardous materials testing. The area includes underground and surface infrastructure built specifically to support what officials describe as plutonium dispersal tests and remediation technology research. Work focused on understanding how radioactive material spreads and how contaminated environments can eventually be cleaned up, lessons drawn directly from the very testing program that originally contaminated the area. Structures throughout Frenchman Flat, some left intentionally standing since the atmospheric testing era specifically to study long-term radiation effects on materials, remain off-limits to anyone without federal security clearance. Access to Frenchman Flat continues to be restricted indefinitely, a section of desert that has spent more than 70 years serving the same basic function, helping the United States government understand the physical consequences of nuclear weapons, first by detonating them in the open air, and later by carefully studying the radioactive landscape those detonations left behind. The Tonopah Test Range, occupying more than 600 square miles within the broader Nellis Air Force Range bordering the Nevada National Security Site, has operated for decades under the management of Sandia National Laboratories, primarily conducting airdrop tests of ballistic shapes used in nuclear weapons design without involving any actual nuclear material. A dry lake bed within the range has been used specifically to test inert nuclear bomb casings, allowing engineers to study the aerodynamic and structural performance of weapon designs under realistic flight and impact conditions. The range's most historically significant underground connection comes from its role housing the living and operational facilities originally built in total secrecy for the F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter program, a Cold War-era aircraft so classified that its very existence was denied publicly for years, while pilots trained and flew from this remote Nevada range under conditions of extraordinary secrecy. Though the F-117 program has since been declassified and the aircraft retired from frontline service, the Tonopah Test Range itself remains an active, fully restricted military testing facility today. Surrounded by the same vast restricted airspace that shields the more famous testing facilities elsewhere in the Nevada Test and Training Range, Tonopah continues conducting classified weapons testing work largely unknown to the public. A sprawling desert facility whose Cold War secrecy never fully ended, simply shifted to newer and equally undisclosed programs. The Nevada National Security Site sits directly adjacent to the Nevada Test and Training Range, a combined restricted airspace and ground facility spanning more than 5,000 square miles, among the largest unpopulated, federally restricted land areas anywhere in the United States. Within this vast restricted zone sits Groom Lake, a dry salt flat home to a highly classified Air Force facility commonly referred to by the public as Area 51, a site whose existence the government did not formally acknowledge until 2013, decades after its actual establishment in 1955. What is officially confirmed about Groom Lake comes almost entirely from declassified CIA records. The site was established to flight test the Lockheed U-2 spy plane, later hosted the supersonic A-12 reconnaissance aircraft under the classified Oxcart program, and subsequently supported development of stealth aircraft technology that eventually produced the F-117 Nighthawk. The facility's extreme secrecy, combined with its proximity to a nuclear testing ground responsible for radioactive contamination across much of the surrounding region, has made it the subject of decades of public speculation, much of it concerning supposed underground facilities that, unlike the site's confirmed surface infrastructure, have never been verified by any released government document or independent evidence. What can be said with certainty is this: Groom Lake remains one of the most heavily restricted and closely guarded military installations on Earth, ringed by warning signs explicitly stating that deadly force is authorized against trespassers, a level of protected secrecy that, regardless of what does or does not lie beneath its surface, has made it the single most famous piece of restricted ground in the entire country. Across the entire Nevada National Security Site, decades of underground nuclear testing left behind contamination that the federal government itself describes as some of the most extensive radioactive groundwater pollution found anywhere in the United States. Roughly a third of all underground tests conducted at the site were detonated directly within aquifers, with many more set off hundreds or thousands of feet below the natural water table, leaving radioactive material dissolved directly into groundwater across large sections of the property. By the Department of Energy's own published estimates, concentrations of radioactivity in some of the most heavily affected groundwater zones beneath the site reach levels millions of times higher than the federal safety standard set for ordinary drinking water. Government scientists continue long-term environmental monitoring across these contaminated zones today, tracking how slowly the radioactivity naturally declines and modeling how far and how fast it might eventually migrate beyond the site's restricted boundary into groundwater systems used elsewhere in the region. No timeline has ever been published for when or whether these underground zones might ever be considered safe enough for any form of public access, leaving an area roughly the size of Rhode Island permanently sealed off beneath the Nevada desert, contaminated by a weapons testing program that ended in 1992, but whose underground consequences, by the government's own admission, will likely persist for generations. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, let us know which of these 9 underground places surprised you the most, and we'll see you in the next one.